everyone, this is our project on statistical research by Connor, Lucia, and Claudia. So let's get started. Basically, our research topic was poverty, and this means not having enough money to get by. So not having enough money to get a means of basic education, access food, shelter, clothing, even medical care, stuff like that. And we chose this topic because it's such a major issue in the world we live in. Even if it doesn't directly impact you, it will most likely at some point impact someone that you know, or at least someone in your town. In Canada alone, there are 5 million people living in poverty, and globally, it's even more. So it's a really important issue, and that's why we chose it. We wanted to delve deeper into maybe what could be the causes of poverty and if there's anything that a country can do to lower their poverty rates and stuff like that. So, some other reasons why studying poverty is really important is because it allows us to become more conscious citizens. So we become more aware of the economical status of our own country and the countries around us. So this is really important knowledge to have. For a country, it's important when determining who would be a suitable trading partner or who needs the most help around the world. For individual people looking at the data, it's important when realizing maybe what it would be like to live in a certain country, if you want to move there, or if you want to go on vacation, or if you're looking at different charities and you don't know where to donate. Overall, it just allows people to become more conscious on the economic status of different countries and how we can improve and what we can do to improve. So our first independent variable was GDP, or gross domestic product, and it's just a measurement of how much a country is producing in terms of goods and services at a given time. And this was a really good independent variable for us because there's data on almost every country in the world, which makes it really obtainable for us, as well as it's a pretty accurate portrayal of how well a country is doing economically, so we know that our overall data and research will end up being accurate as a result of this as well. So our first dependent variable was employment rate. This is a relative number, so a frequency per 100,000 people, and it measures out of everyone in the country that is able to work, how many are actually working. So by able to work, I mean they aren't kids, they aren't elderly or retired, and they aren't disabled. So this number will take that into account, which makes it overall more accurate, and this is why we would want to use it as well. Our second dependent variable was poverty rate. So again, this was a frequency per 100,000 people, and it basically just measures out of everyone in the country how many are living below the poverty line. And this poverty line will be different depending on every country because different countries have different currencies and standards of living, and it's basically the poverty line per country will just be determined by that country and what they deem to be in the minimum income level that you need to be making in order to get by in that country. So again, this would make it more accurate because not every country is the same and you can't measure them the same either. And our linking variable, as you might have noticed, is country. So we take all this information from different countries, and overall we got 102 of them, which means that's how many pieces of data we have, and this would make our final results more accurate. So when you're looking at the actual statistics of the information that we gathered, you can see that the mean and median for employment rates are pretty similar. They're less than 1 apart, and so there wouldn't really be a big difference if we wanted to use mean or median to represent or portray our data for employment rate. But when you're looking at the poverty rate statistics, you can see that there's a big difference. And the main reason for that is because we noticed a lot of outliers in this set of data. Basically, most of the data was within a lower range, so between 1 and maybe 15%. But there were some countries that had poverty rates as high as 60 and 70. So this really skewed data, or the average. So in terms of this, the median would be the more accurate representation for a poverty rate because it's not heavily affected by those outliers, and it's not representing or saying something that isn't necessarily true, which in this case would be that overall the world has a higher poverty rate than we actually do, because most countries, fortunately, have a relatively low poverty rate. So, like I kind of talked about before, our data is not super consistent in terms of how far it varies from the mean. This is kind of to be expected because we're looking at a bunch of different countries and a bunch of different information, and in the world that we live in currently, we can't really expect that rates such as these are going to be very equal. There are some countries that are very well off economically and are very rich, and there are some countries that are not so well off and very underdeveloped and have a lot of impoverished people. So you can't expect these numbers to be very consistent in the world we live in today. Overall, employment rate was more consistent than poverty rate, as you can see from the standard deviations on the screen. So when looking at the correlation coefficients, we actually find very weak relationships between our independent and dependent variables. Although it was not what we expected, it's not completely crazy that this happens, as there are a lot of other external factors that could affect a country's GDP or stuff like that. We were expecting it to be negative as it is, but we were expecting it to be much stronger. So negative 0.36 approximately is not a very, it's not a strong relationship at all. It's very weak. And employment rate surprised us the most because we were expecting it to be positive. We expected the GDP of a country to make the employment rate pretty high. So the higher the GDP, the higher the employment rate. But the reverse was actually kind of true, although it's still pretty weak. So we find that there's not really a relationship between these two variables at all.
The following histogram shows the comparison between the poverty rate and percentages and the frequency. You can see that the histogram is quite majorly rightly skewed, so we have a lot of data in the lower margin. This means for us that most countries have a relatively low poverty rate in comparison. This next histogram talks about the employment rate percentage and the frequency. It takes on a unimodal shape, so there's one peak in the center that's significantly higher than the rest of the data, and it doesn't quite follow suit. It does not follow a normal distribution to any means. For this, or that means to us that employment rates are varied throughout the countries, and a lot of our data sits between the 55 and 60% ranges.
This box and whisker plot indicates that there are outliers in our data. Since data was taken from different countries that are first world and third world, this makes sense that not all of them are going to be the same, because if you have a more developed country, it would indicate that they would have a lower poverty rate and a higher employment rate, and vice versa. This next graph shows that there is a very weak correlation between the GDP and employment rate, and also shows that there is a low negative correlation between the GDP and poverty rate. There are multiple reasons why this may occur. Although we thought there would be a stronger correlation between these variables, there are many external factors that may be affecting our data. For example, in poorer countries where there's a lot of exporting and manufacturing of goods, the country would earn a higher GDP. However, employment rates may still be low and poverty rates may still be high.
So overall, the correlation between our variables were not strong. And although it was quite surprising and we were expecting a different result, it still makes sense. And we're motivated to learn more about what really affects poverty and how we can fix it and prevent it in the future. Thanks for watching, guys. Here's our citations.